Hello, and thank you for joining us on this Babel PR webinar. I'm Declan Bradshaw. I'm an Associate Director here at Babel, and I think MWC 25 will be my 7th show. But joining me on the panel today are 3 expert analysts who I think maybe have been to a few more than that. We'll start with Ruth Brown, who's joining us from Heavy Reading. How many MWCs have you been to, Ruth?
So actually, next year will be my 3rd. I used to track them a lot when I worked at BT before, but yeah, I was more behind the scenes making the proof of concepts that would go to Mobile World Congress.
Brilliant. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Rob Curran, who's joining us from Appledore Research, a fellow industry veteran. Great to have you with us, Rob. Again, I think you've been out to Barcelona a few times yourself.
Yes, a few times. I think you can normally tell how old people are in the industry by if they still talk about when it was in Cannes. So that sort of gives you a bit of a benchmark. But yes, I did go to Cannes just once. I think I was there the year before they started doing helicopter rides. But anyway, that's going back a few years. But yes, I've been to quite a few recently.
Maybe there'll be helicopter rides in 2025. Who knows? But one of the hot topics.
Who knows? The flying helicopters. We were promised them, and they're
exactly.
yet to come.
And finally, pleased to introduce James Crawshaw from Omdia. Again, James, I think an industry veteran, so I'm sure a few MWCs under your belt as well.
I'll take that as a compliment, Declan. Yes, I've been to the MWC quite a few times, and including when it was back in Cannes, back in the day. And of course, it's bigger and better now, and it's a great event to go and catch up with people.
Well, actually, James, it's almost like you knew where we were heading with the questions, because it's a very great transition to my first question, which is really just to ask you all, how important is MWC as an event for all of you, both in terms of networking and kind of maintaining those industry contacts, but also expanding your knowledge and kind of immersing yourself in the industry? Where does MWC stack up? James, I don't know whether you want to take that one first.
Right. Okay. Well, working for an events company, Informa. No, I should say it's obviously very, very important. I think what I often hear from the vendor community, who will often stump up a lot of money to be at this event and to have a booth, etc., is that it gives them access to C-level executives that they wouldn't ordinarily get to meet or to get to have any time with, and it's not always immediately clear that leads to a deal, but the general feeling is that this is quite unique in terms of the level of exposure. You're not going to get a very technical person necessarily who's the specialist in your product area. But the opportunity perhaps for your CEO to meet with their CEO can help to oil the wheels of commerce. Got there in the
end. Sure, and I think definitely we hear a lot about that kind of level of senior spokesperson that's available, senior exec that's available. Rob, if I can bring you in on this as well, how does MWC kind of stack up in your diary and kind of significance for your year in terms of networking and things like that?
Yeah, it's very important. It is very important. It's clear. I mean, it serves a number of different purposes. Partly, I mean, just the sheer size of the event. I think during the kind of COVID years, there was maybe a sort of concern that maybe it would be killed off by that. In fact, I think it's exactly the reverse. It's really sort of bounced back because it's such a unique event in the whole calendar. It is enormous though, and certainly that always took me by surprise in the early years. And there are trade shows and then there are trade shows and then MWC. It really is vast. So just the sheer number of people who are there, the sheer variety of information offer and companies to see, both large and small, and it is also important because. It's not just a gathering. I know that some of the larger companies, I've worked inside of some of those in supporting their MWC presence back in an earlier life. But it's very important because that's really as far as the starting pistol for the whole of the next year of business development. So MWC provides a very useful forcing function. There are hundreds of people. I mean, there are people you see, but then there are hundreds of people behind them, all rushing to get demos finished and products launched and press releases written and so on. And that's really, I know it's a busy environment, but that's the place that getting it right there gives you that acceleration into through the rest of the year. So it is really, really important. And so taking advantage of that is is a key thing for vendors, I think, and operators to do.
I think that's a really valuable point about just where it falls in the calendar year, and as you said, how it sort of sets up sales opportunities for the rest of the year. Ruth, if I can just get your take on kind of MWC as well, maybe perhaps more from that knowledge gathering point of view. How does the show kind of stack up in terms of its significance?
Yeah, so I mean, great points, obviously mentioned by Robert and James previously, but you're right, gathering knowledge is kind of a massive thing for the show. So I mentioned before, when I worked at BT, my role was very much, as Robert mentioned, in the background, putting stuff together to kind of showcase with other partners at Mobile World Congress, to kind of show what was available, the art of the possible, as I worked at a research team. So I feel like I've flipped roles a bit. So now I'm the person going along, trying to see what's happening, having these conversations, both in terms of what's possible, what kind of timelines. I'm really understanding all the perspectives that I, as a service provider, I remember I used to be, following the news back during Mobile World Congress and wanting to know all the insights.
Great. Well, obviously, I think varying perspectives on the show, where it sits, but I think we can all agree certainly a tentpole event for the industry. But thinking ahead, two main topics and all the kind of buzzwords and acronyms that we love in telecoms, what do you think will be kind of the main topics of interest for the show next year, maybe outside of the GSMA sort of given themes? Or anything in particular in your fields of research or expertise that you're really hoping to learn more about at the show?
Let's have Ruth go first in reverse order.
Yeah. So obviously, probably like the others going to say, I think AI is still going to be massive across every kind of flavor. AI ran in the network, data centers, device. There was a lot last year about generative AI and how we need to transform data. I'm not expecting that to go away, so I think that'll be a lot more. I think also this year, a lot more traction behind sort of Wi-Fi 7. That's been building. We've seen this year some service providers launching, their residential gateways for sort of homes and stuff with Wi-Fi 7, and also a lot of the big vendors also launching with that. Monetization, I also think, will continue. We're seeing 5G Advance starting to happen. And obviously operators are really keen to start monetizing, as they build out their 5G SA network. So I think we'll also see that. So I'm keen to understand the real examples about how they think they're going to monetize, and whether we're also going to see some of the early 5G advanced use cases, maybe some of the red cap devices we've been talking about in conjunction with eSIM.
Lots to cover there. I agree. Yeah, have a feeling AI might pop up on a few booths out there. Robert, what about yourself in terms of main topics of interest for the show?
Yeah, so AI, that's a given. I think the evolution of it this year might be, because there were quite a lot of announcements last year, and it's taken a while for some of those to sort of work through the system and for people to understand what they really meant. I think this year we will see a kind of follow-on of that story, a more refinement of where AI is being impactful or can be impactful. And I think a corollary to that is again more, which we started to see last year, more about the implications across the stack, if you like. So from the silicon upwards and the different layers now that are becoming a bit more visible, rather than just kind of verticalized technologies. Certainly that's what we expect to see a lot more of. So again, strong play from the hardware vendors. Ecosystems was a feature of last year and will continue to be a feature this year. And last year we saw people like NTT, NEC, the OREX thing in Open RAN, bringing that more to the fore. So expecting to see more of that. I know Open RAN's had a bit of a bumpy ride this year, but I don't see that going anywhere other than where it's been, which is increasingly as a kind of mainstream promotion. So I expect that to feature quite strongly as vendors of all shapes and sizes declare their Open RAN credentials for various reasons. But yeah, so those are kind of two areas I'd highlight. We're going to see just in AI, energy is not going away as an issue. We're going to continue to see that. So all the things around that, CO2 and sustainability, those are my kind of major themes. One thing I did want to kind of respond to Ruth a little bit, because she's seen both sides of this. It seems to me that operators more and more are presenting themselves more directly. I mean, when you go to the Telefonica booth or the Deutsche Telekom booth, those are big booths, even Vodafone. HNT, they're big booths, and they're also in the selling mode, which is kind of interesting. And I think that's been an interesting shift in the last sort of 5 years. It used to be it was a base station sales event, and it's really expanded way beyond that. Oh, I've gone slightly blurry. Apologies for that. So again, I'm always interested to see those companies almost run a program within a program, and it's interesting seeing what they're doing. How they're bringing new ideas to market and new offers for people to buy. So
I think to your point, Robert, you're absolutely right. So in the past, especially when I was working on these kind of proof of concept demos, so I remember just before the Mobile World Congress that was cancelled for COVID, putting together an early network slicing and orchestration model. And that was one, that was showcased on a vendor's stand. But I mean, certainly in the last few years, there have been huge presence from some of these really big service providers, especially sort of the Middle Eastern sites have had really impressive stands, haven't they? Like Etisalat, for example. So yeah, absolutely. It's a slight change, perhaps.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a deliberate effort, isn't there, particularly from the GSMA to expand the show's remit and attract different types of companies. James, really keen to bring you in on this as well in terms of hot topics that you're going to have your eye on out in Barcelona.
Well, I've got the easy job because I get to go last. So I hear all the things that Ruth and Robert have reminded me of. But no, if I was to pick 3 themes, I think given that it's a GSMA event, Open Gateway will be one of them. I think there'll be lots of new announcements about operators and APIs and partners and the ecosystem. I think the other area where there'll be an evolution from last year, so more mature, is the whole AI. I never remember. Is it on-RAN, and-RAN, with-RAN, under-RAN? The whole AI, basically, using spare capacity in your RAN processing to do AI inferencing as a sort of guideline. So that's a topic I think that there's a lot of money behind. There's a rather large vendor who's interested in that topic, and so I imagine there'll be a lot of interest in that. And then the third topic, which I think is gathering steam, is satellites. So the whole direct-to-device and convergence or cooperation, if you like, between satellite communications and traditional cellular communications, and how those two can complement each other, whether it's in IoT or if you're out in the sticks and can't get a cell phone signal, the satellites can help that way. So I think that's another interesting area that I'm certainly keen to learn more about.
So definitely, it's, as you said, one that's been, I think, growing in prominence over the last few years. Between the three of you, you've touched on loads of different topics there, and I think later on in the session we'll, I guess, touch on how companies can best reach out to you and maybe speak to your specific areas of interest. But before we get into that, from a purely logistical point of view, I'd love to ask, how do you go about structuring your diary for the show in terms of how available you make yourself? How many briefings do you typically look to take while you're out in Barcelona, and I guess in the weeks leading up to as well, which is often forgotten about? Ruth, maybe if we start with you in terms of your schedule and where you look to slot briefings in.
So typically I like to go to, there's a few really large briefings, like T-Mobile always do a large briefing. I think it's on the Tuesday, which I like to go to, and a few others do these big briefings where they're kind of bringing in sort of vendor partners and sharing a lot of knowledge. But I think last year I did something like over 30 during the week, which was a lot. I had trainers, I had protein bars. It was like a marathon race of it.
Portable charger on the go.
Absolutely. I got advice about bring water in your bag and try and keep in the same hall. And I think the thing is, I started not to get too packed out, but then you always want to squeeze in something interesting, which I don't regret. I had some fantastic meetings, learned a lot, had some really good conversations. So I think you've got to prepare yourself for the energy burn as well as the sort of mental kind of workout, I suppose, because it's a great opportunity to meet with people and also understand about new ideas and new companies.
Great. James, what about yourself? 30, the number to beat. Would you go for more or less?
Oh, it's about quality, not quantity, Declan. So
Very valid
no,
point. Yeah.
I can certainly sympathise with Ruth about needing to be in shape and bring your own food supply and water supply. You know, the food there is the food on offer can sometimes be a bit ropey, and it's certainly very expensive, and the queues are enormous. So take your own.
Blasphemy, James.
Yeah. Take your own bathroom as well if you can do, because the queues can be very long. So companies are already reaching out pre-Christmas, trying to get meetings in the diary, you know, but it's a balancing act for them. You know, obviously they want to get customers in the diary, and analysts are often a sort of a filler, which I don't mind. I totally understand. I want them to be engaging with customers and selling. So it's a bit of a I don't know quite how to describe the process, but it's like a sort of, somebody likened it once to a dance card at a party. If you could imagine in the 1920s or something, you would have a dance card and gentlemen would come along and write their name in it and take their turn to have a 5-minute dance with you or something like that. So it's a similar sort of process, and there's a bit of flirting that goes on, and hopefully, you know, essentially, if you don't have time to meet with a particular company, I always seek to have a follow-up meeting after the event. At the event itself, it doesn't need to be a long meeting. To be honest, both parties will probably have forgotten who they met with by the end of the week, but it's just a touch point, and sort of press the flesh, see somebody in person, look them in the whites of the eyes and all that. But yeah, any sort of meaningful transfer of information and ideas will probably happen subsequently rather than during those 30-minute slots.
So that's a great point, and I guess I want to bring you in on, Rob. Having spoken about the importance of kind of networking at the event, how do the weeks sort of pre and post the show itself stack up in terms of your diary? Are they sort of better to maybe target for, I guess, a few of those deeper dive briefings?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's, again, I've seen it both sides. Trying to brief 10 analysts in a day is quite tricky when you've got customers and salespeople buzzing around and changing your agenda and so on. That's hard. I think from an analyst perspective, trying to get that balance right. Make it be busy but not too busy, and that's the tricky balancing act that we always try to manage. Some meetings can be short, and that's fine. Some are worth taking a 45-minute slot for. I think in general, planning for an hour is outside of the big events that Ruth mentioned. An hour-long meeting is a lot of time for an analyst to devote. It's a lot of time for a supplier or a exhibitor to take as well. So I think that's also part of the process, is trying to be efficient about it. It's not really about how much can you cram in, it's about how can you use the time efficiently. So I think we've seen, certainly last year and to some extent the year before, a gentle increase in the number of pre-brief activities. So companies reaching out ahead of time, which is interesting. Some of the larger companies are doing that, but even some of the smaller ones as well, because it can be good to, it's very hard going in completely cold to a meeting with very, very little context for it on the show floor, even where the meeting's arranged, because often the people you're talking to, even if your organizers, your wranglers and contacts have been good and efficient in sharing information, it's kind of disappointing to turn up with somebody who doesn't know why they're there, let alone why you're there. So I think a bit of preparation, whether that's done through a bit of pre-briefing, or whether it's done with expectation setting, which is, let's meet some key people, make some introductions and contacts, connections, and then with an express aim to follow through in the month or so afterwards. I think that's a more measured strategy rather than just, fill to James's analogy, fill the dance card full. That may not be the best strategy. It'll check some boxes and give you some numbers, but I think there are, particularly when dealing with analysts, there are other metrics of success, I think, in the engagement process.
Absolutely. I think you've brought up a really valuable point that we were going to come on to a bit later, but I think it makes sense to move there now, in terms of how companies make the most of those slots with you. And I think kind of the message is, maybe less is more in terms of time and not needing the full hour. But if we say, for argument's sake, they have a 30-minute slot with you, what's the key takeaways that you're looking for? Obviously, you mentioned having a spokesperson on the other end that knows why they're there to speak to you and are engaged in the conversation. But outside of that, what would be your advice for making the most of that 30-minute slot, and I guess not making it an overtly sort of sales-focused conversation, and what you might necessarily want out of it for your own research? How can businesses sort of make the most of their time? We'll start with you, Rob, and then we'll work around.
I think I'm going to take a slight step back. It's really, really important to understand the difference between media and analysts. That's you and everyone on this call knows that very well. But I think sometimes, particularly with companies who are not that familiar with the analyst space, they kind of lump the two together, and it's PR/AR, and a lot of the mechanics are seen to be the same thing. They're really subtly different, and it's not the one who's better or worse than the other, but they're different. And so I think part of the an analyst briefing, I think, is quite different in nature than a media briefing. There's some things that are the same, though, which is, from an analyst point of view, be clear about the most important thing that you want to communicate. And that may not be today's news, which is where the difference with PR comes in. For an analyst, I would tend to approach an analyst briefing as somewhere between an investor briefing and a media briefing. You need a little bit of longer term strategy. That's what the analysts want to find out from you. Why are you here, as it were? Not disrespectfully, but why are you here at MWC? Where are you going? What is new? Fine, but we can all read the press releases. The key question is, why is that news? Why is that important in your business? Why does that matter to the industry? And those are really the questions that I think should be framing the conversations that you have with analysts. It's a useful check, because if you don't feel you can answer those questions, then maybe you're not quite at the right point where you need that level of engagement, or maybe you need some help getting there. Either is a reasonable outcome. So I think just a bit of preparation. Recognize the difference between the two things. Analysts are a bit less news focused than media, different purposes, and a bit more trend focused, if you like. And so I would encourage people preparing for analyst briefings to try to lean that way in terms of what they want to communicate. And you can use a 25-minute presentation for discussion very successfully. One last point, just to help kind of baseline that, I'd say try and avoid planning for demos with analysts. Analysts generally don't want to see demos. They might be very impressive at a personal level, but it's not really what analysts want to see. And it inevitably takes up too much time. There's too much of a script. There's not enough time to run through everything. And you don't actually communicate what was important to communicate to that particular analyst. So I'll stop there. And that would be my kind of nutshell advice for that.
No, that was really some really great points in there, Rob. James, if I bring you in on that, is there anything maybe that Rob left out that you think's pertinent, or something you want to build on, perhaps?
Yeah, food and drink. Make sure that you have lots of food and lots of drink available for the analysts and the press too. They need to eat because they'll be coming starving, and they'll be low blood sugar. So you want to perk them up so that they're listening and attentive. Yeah, I think very often what the interesting meetings are where the company talks to you about a problem or a challenge they've got. It's not, we don't just want to hear, we're great, we're winning all the deals, our product sells like hotcakes. We want to hear a challenge. We've got this new AI capability, but we don't know how to charge for it, or we're trying to move down into the tier 2 telco markets, but our product doesn't scale, or whatever it is. So we're interested in honest, open discussions. We don't expect you to air all your dirty laundry, but those sort of things are thought-provoking, because if it's a challenge that you're facing, it's probably a challenge that many others are facing too, and it then gives us food for thought for potential research that we could do.
Absolutely, I think that's a great point. And Ruth, bring you in on this as well. Do you think that, and obviously Rob brought it up first, that distinction between analyst relations and maybe media relations is clear enough in that companies understand it can be a two-way conversation, and you can kind of have that level of candor that James is talking about, where you can be more open about the challenges that you're perhaps facing?
I think quite often that is a common misconception and people get confused. So I've even had invitations to me as a journalist, and I've had to explain, no, I'm not a journalist. I think both, James and Robert brought up great points. It's more of a conversation than someone just talking at you for 30 minutes. I think yeah, it's great to hear about, you know, the company, what they're doing, but there also needs to be a bit of a give and take in terms of giving us time to ask questions and to kind of drill in on bits that are really important. Also being able to question the timelines. I think, you know, where you get companies that there's others that do similar things, it's also interesting to be able to get into, you know, what's different with you compared to these people. And James mentioned this as well, you know, I want to hear about the solution, sort of warts and all, because I think if people don't mention that, I'm almost sometimes worrying, you know, is that a real product? Why are you not finding issues? Or maybe you're not comfortable in sharing that, but the better stories and the better information comes out from the free discussion both ways, which I think, you know, James and Robert also mentioned, and water as well. James, good point. Water is essential.
And coffee.
Coffee, yeah.
I think most of the booths tend to have little mini breath mints. I always appreciate those as well when you've had the fear of food that you were talking about earlier, James. We do have a question from our audience that I'm keen that we get to, and I think a good opportunity to maybe bring us back to scheduling briefings and how you go about looking at your diary. So a question from Katerina, thank you for submitting it. Anyone else with questions, please do put them in, and we'll try and get to more of them if we can. How do you select the briefings that you attend, and what should a vendor keep in mind to book meetings with analysts? So I guess what kind of stands out in terms of a pitch? What's the best way to get in touch with you? How can vendors get on your radar essentially and secure one of those crucial slots? Rob, I don't know whether you take that one first.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different questions in together there. I think, to be honest, the first thing is a little bit of background. I mean, if you're reaching out to analysts, there aren't that many of us. I mean, there are plenty of us, but not that many of us. And it really goes a long way to do a little bit of research on the analysts and what their focus area is. That counts a long way. So getting an inbound pitch, which is not just "Dear, your name here," you know, we have the world leading solution for XYZ, but something that says, "Look, we know you've been publishing research in this area, that area. You've covered these companies and those companies, and we're in this other space." Just that little, 20 minutes of research will make all the difference in terms of picking up briefing. It will also help you, frankly, qualify out analysts who aren't relevant to you, which again, that's an important part of the process for us as it is for vendors. There's no point in taking time with analysts who are not focused on your area. So I do think a little bit of research on that helps make your pitch more appealing and better targeted. I think obviously access to someone medium to senior. It doesn't always have to be the CEO. I think as James and Ruth both kind of inferred there, if all the CEO is going to do is give you a kind of corporate pitch, probably that's not the right person to meet with. Let's meet with the head of product or customer success or something else. Someone who will be able to have a bit more of a conversation, a bit more of a two-way. So making that kind of offer, which is again a little different than perhaps a media outlet might want to look for just the person at the top of the tree. I think we have a bit more flexibility, a bit more leeway. So I'd say those two things. Just a little bit of research. Know who you're talking to. Know why you're reaching out. Put yourselves in our shoes, as it were. Why would we want to meet with you? Why would any one of us at an individual level want to reserve some time, not to be critical, but just to say, is this on target for us? That I think will certainly help, and it doesn't take a lot of effort, and well worthwhile. Don't just hit the button in MailChimp or HubSpot or something and send out 100 emails. That's it's not a great strategy.
Absolutely. Ruth, what about yourself in terms of how you go about selecting which companies to give one of those slots to in Barcelona?
So I think Rob picked up some really interesting and valid points. I tend to pick ones where people have sent me something a bit more personalized. They actually know what I cover rather than this big blanket I've spammed or sent invites out to like thousands of people hoping for an invite, and it might be something so different to what you actually cover. I think also to be aware that most analysts will, want to meet with companies that they've also worked with and, have some sort of FaceTime with them. So don't, if someone, or if we need to schedule you or say we've got this slot or this slot, don't be disappointed. We do want to hear from you. And perhaps if there isn't time just because of, people's different agendas and trying to schedule something, follow up after maybe World Congress, because if it's a really interesting topic, always like to hear about it, you know, hear what's new, what's different. And I know Robert and James were talking about the demos. I actually quite like a demo, but I have to say I prefer to see them on the Thursday when it's a little bit quieter, and then I've got the time to enjoy it and see the demo in full place, rather than I've got 5 minutes, are we overrunning, and you're panicking about time rather than the content.
For sure. Well, maybe that's the key to the successful pitch. Thursdays for demos. That's the best way to get them in. James, going to bring you in. All three of you are obviously very active on LinkedIn. Keen to ask you, James, whether that's a good way for brands to reach out to you compared to sort of email and you know, your work phone and kind of the traditional ways of doing it. How is social media changing how you engage with brands and how you prepare for these briefings?
Well, nobody's run the work phone since about 2002. So
well, I did think that, but I had to just mention just in case. Some people still use them.
So email is fine. james.crawshaw@omdia.com. No, I'd rather not receive on LinkedIn. So email is the best way, and I don't mind, to be honest. I mean, I get a lot of irrelevant emails, and as long as you don't mind me deleting it without responding, I don't mind you sending it. How do analysts choose which briefings to take? Well, obviously we're working in a business, so we're obviously going to look to make sure we meet with existing customers, those who subscribe to our research. It's an important touch point, you know, for us as a supplier to them. And then we similarly, you know, we're always looking for new people, new customers, new subscribers to the research. So if we think our research is relevant to a particular company, then we'd be very keen to meet with them. And then what spaces are left are things that you know, you're researching a particular topic, but there might not be a commercial angle. You're just interested in it, or for example, your telecom operator customers might be interested in that topic, but the vendors might be too small to ever buy the research. So there's no commercial angle with the company you're meeting with, but what you're doing is gathering insight in order to produce valuable content for your subscription customers. So, you know, these are commercial decisions ultimately.
Yeah, I think again a really valid point. And we've had a lot about sort of targeting and understanding, you know, your remits as well. Of course, I should say the best way to make sure you maximize briefings to secure one of those slots is to work with an expert agency. But of course, I would say that. Thinking about the specifics of, as you said there, James, you know, the research that you're trying to attract subscribers to. We've kind of touched on this already, but do you feel that the role of kind of an analyst is broadly understood, particularly by some of the newer kind of scale-up businesses that are entering the industry? We spoke about the GSMA expanding MWC's remit in terms of different verticals, but that also means, again, a focus on perhaps newer businesses to analyst relations haven't necessarily done it before. Do you feel that there's a good understanding of what you're trying to get out of that conversation and kind of your business model in terms of the research that you're trying to promote, or are there some misconceptions there? Again, James, maybe if we start with you and we'll work round.
There's lots of misconceptions, because unless you've actually worked inside the business, you wouldn't necessarily know how it works or understand the subtle differences that Robert and Ruth mentioned between it and journalism. So yeah, there are lots of misconceptions about how it works, and that's perhaps where Declan, people like you, can help to, you know, make it clearer, help them understand what our business model is and how we can potentially work together.
Do you think there's probably an element there of you know, obviously the theme of this webinar is MWC, but do you think there's an element of not just treating it as a one and done time of year to engage, but actually mapping out a year's worth of keeping you updated, kind of understanding the best time to reach out, the best time to kind of push news, and then what your rhythms are of when you commission research and when you kind of look to dive into different areas? Do you think it's more about taking that 12-month view rather than the MWC kind of centric view?
Yes, and of course, you know, in MWC, there's a lot. Everybody's making noise, so you're going to get lost in that maelstrom. You know, if you're a smaller vendor and you've got something important to say, wait until April. Don't do it on the 1st of March. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it needs to be something that's continuous throughout the year, but also bear in mind, trying to sort of expand a little bit upon this difference between journalists and analysts. I use the fantastic tech journalists that are out there and their publications as a filter for me. I cannot read every press release that goes out, nor would I wish to. They're doing a fantastic job of filtering out the noise and picking out the interesting stuff. And I rely on them to do a lot of that heavy lifting for me. So yeah, totally value their input, and they make my job a lot easier.
That's a really valuable point as well. I think lots of brands maybe see them in isolation and not how the two can really complement each other and kind of engage in both media and analysts at the same time. Ruth, what about yourself in terms of feeling about whether people understand kind of your role and what you're looking to get out of these meetings, and maybe any sort of myth busting that might need to be done?
Yeah, so I agree with James about, the analyst relations are helpful. So quite often, they have, spoken with their clients, they understand the role. Also, people seem to understand the different type of analysts. So obviously, Omdia, for example, do more of subscription-based analysis of things and writing and reports, whereas we are writing for a particular sort of sponsored subject or on a certain aspect. So I think that's also helpful to differentiate between the different types of analyst work. Also, I think it's useful to like James mentioned, the sort of journalists and sort of tech media make a fantastic contribution, but there are subtle differences, and I suppose our role is part kind of being relevant and influencing, but also having these more privileged conversations. So people need to feel comfortable that they can speak to us and we're not, they're not going to see what they've said in the media the very next day. So it is definitely, it's a very different type of role, and one, especially around the privileged conversation, we're not going to be saying that if that's something you've told us confidentially.
Yes, understanding that there's that kind of mutual trust about basically understanding what's happening in the sector. Absolutely. And Rob, to bring you in on this as well, what about yourself in terms of companies that you're dealing with, again, maybe newer to analyst relations rather than the sort of established brands, about understanding your role and maybe misconceptions that would be useful to discuss?
Yeah, I think again, Ruth and James have touched on excellent points. The thread of that I'd like to pick up on is just that sense of it being treat it more as a conversation, more as a two-way thing. Part of preparation, James touched on, and Ruth certainly did. Come to analyst briefings with a question in mind. That you'll get a lot more value if you come with a question to which the answer would be meaningful to you. That helps as well, because I guess that's part of where analysts live. We live in that gray area. We live in the market that hasn't yet formed, that hasn't yet consolidated, the things that haven't yet happened, in a way that journalism is kind of reacting to some extent to things that have happened. That's news. It's by definition is news. And I think understanding that, I think James said, if you haven't got news for MWC, release it in April. That's fine. It doesn't prevent you having a meaningful analyst conversation at MWC. So again, understanding that the analyst perhaps a longer term view, it is a complementary role, but our business, to James's point, our business is information and intelligence, and market intelligence is the things that are happening in places that you can't see. And Ruth alluded to this as well. We're party to all kinds of conversations. That doesn't mean that we're kind of constantly blabbing things out, but it does mean that we're able to get a sense of, are vendors talking about the same things or different things, or are there new spaces, or is this kind of same old? Is the mood gloomy or optimistic? That sort of level. So I think using, for your clients, look at MWC as far as analysts goes as an opportunity, not just to kind of broadcast, not just to check the boxes. Hey, we talked at 20, 30 people for half an hour or 3 days, but use it as an opportunity to say, actually, we got a feel for some of the questions that are material to our business, whether they're hard questions to answer or easy questions to answer, and who are the different kind of companies and individuals who can help us to answer those questions, and treat it as a longer term, potentially a longer term relationship. But definitely view it in that way. Nothing wrong at all with the journalism side of things. Absolutely terrific people in our business doing an excellent job. Certainly want to reinforce that. It's not an either or. These are two different elements of your of your go-to-market plan, marketing strategy, and your industry engagement, and you definitely look at them as distinct and complementary.
Absolutely. And James, I guess coming back to you on that, do you think it's maybe a missed opportunity where businesses don't think about asking you the questions, as Rob said, and kind of making that two-way conversation, and it is more just kind of that broadcast? Do you think that's sort of a missed opportunity in terms of engaging your expertise and the obviously other businesses you're speaking to in the same ecosystem where maybe you can help guide them? Do you think that businesses sort of miss a trick there?
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking earlier when we were discussing this that the analogy would be that the analysts are like priests that you go to confession, whereas the journalists are like town criers. So they'll get your message out if it's interesting, but we'll be able to. You can confide in us, and we'll share insights that we've gathered anonymously from our other industry contacts, and we learn through the process. Hopefully, you learn some things through the process. And it adds some value.
And conscious of the time and letting some more audience questions come in, but Ruth, did just want to get your take on that as well, about whether you feel that there's enough of that kind of two-way engagement and people sort of being willing to ask you questions, and perhaps maybe as Robert alluded to, those uncomfortable questions about where the kind of industry is moving that might need to be answered.
So I think it's always good when you're having a meeting and people actually ask your opinion. Where do you think this is going? And you can have this real dialogue. So I can ask a question back like, well, actually, is this solution going to work? Are people going to buy it? So that two-way conversation is really good. I think you can have sometimes too much where you go in and the meeting is just the analyst asking questions. So I've seen it sometimes too much the other way, where I'm just sort of prizing information, and I totally understand towards the end of the day people are probably exhausted and they've had a lot of meetings, but sometimes it is just a briefing. So I think it's getting the balance right. It's allowing enough time for the vendor to give the information out that they really want to share with you or get your advice on, but it's allowing that two-way dialogue as well.
Brilliant. And James, you mentioned earlier already having had some requests come in, some potential pitches for briefings coming in. I'm sure it's the same for all three of you. Is now a good time to be reaching out pre-Christmas? Again, that separation of MWC 25, well, that's a next year problem. Is now a good time? Well, maybe not right now because we're on this webinar, but is now a good time to be reaching out, or would you encourage companies to maybe go closer to the show when they kind of have their full picture of what they want to be talking about and their news? What's kind of the balance of timing? When's a good time to reach out in terms of just making sure they can kind of capture your interest at the right time, at the optimal moment?
I don't think there's any harm in reaching out sooner. But obviously, the analysts and journalists will be trying to, optimize their calendars as well. So I think it's a case of reaching out, making the offer. You might not hear anything back. Reaching out a month later, and then as you approach the event, there'll be opportunity to fill up any remaining slots that people might have. So yeah, absolutely, reach out. Should be reaching out for Mobile World Congress 2027 shortly.
I've seen some pictures in my time. I haven't quite seen 3 years out, but I wouldn't be too surprised. Ruth, what about yourself in terms of when's a good time to pique your interest for the show?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So reach out early, share what you want to do. Some of these pre-briefings are actually quite good as well. So you do a pre-briefing maybe a few weeks before, where it might be a vendor who's got lots of different aspects that they cover. It actually allows you to kind of shrink down the choice of what you want to see, or really focus in on subjects that you're covering in terms of your own research, and maybe stuff that's evolving quicker than other areas. So if your time is limited, you can actually focus in on different topics. But I would definitely say reach out further. If you don't hear immediately, it isn't because we don't want to see you. Sometimes we're trying to wait to hear back from someone so we don't double book ourselves, and just so we can see as many people as possible normally.
Lots of plates to spin, isn't there? And again, I think the temptation of, I'll just follow up. Sometimes I think patience can be key there. Robert, what about yourself in terms of a good time? And are you sort of a pre-Christmas or a post-Christmas person? When you really...
I agree. Like you said, I'm sure all of us we certainly all had started to have those inbound requests. I think in line with the comments that we mentioned earlier, there's no issue at all with even for a smaller company doing a little bit of pre-briefing 2-3 weeks ahead of time, and with the intention of trying to initiate something that you can then fulfill on at the show. It's so difficult. James mentioned noise. It's so difficult to get brain space and airtime at the event, and I would encourage people to think from an analyst relations point of view. Try to think of this in a couple of different phases. You've got to build up a little bit of relationship first. The show is a chance to follow through on that, and then potentially sort of post-show engagement. So rather than put all your eggs in one basket and say either we get a analyst briefing at MWC or it's a disaster, don't look at it like that. That's not really a constructive way. It's the right way to look at it. Definitely see it as part of an ongoing engagement, whether or not you end up kind of commercially doing something with an analyst or not. It's worth everybody's time to have that in mind, at least, and have the opportunity to do that. So I think there isn't particularly a bad time other than the last few days. I mean, people are already traveling in that final week. Some people are extending their trips and so on. So if you're starting to reach out for analysts at that point, that's going to be extremely low success. So I would say encourage people to think of it as more of a strategy. Do multiple things over time. Be focused and just try to focus on the most appropriate meetings, not necessarily the largest quantity.
All sound advice. Well, it looks like there aren't any further questions from our audience, so I guess we'll take the opportunity to do a round of final thoughts in terms of what you're most looking forward to at the show. I know we touched on big topics, but if there's one thing in particular that you really wanted to bring the audience's attention to for next year and what you're hoping to get out of the show, what would it be? Again, mine might be a few more of those breath mints, but on a more serious level, James, is there anything in particular as a final thought in terms of planning for next year's show that you're looking forward to?
Gosh, okay, big question, Declan. Apart from food and drink, and just being in wonderful Barcelona and having the opportunity to network. I mean, one thing that didn't come up that I did want to mention earlier is do leave a little bit of time in your schedule, both if you're an exhibitor, an attendee, or indeed part of our analyst and media community. Do leave a little bit of time in your schedule at the show to go and check out some of those wonderful, wacky halls with lots of very small companies in them, just because there might be something, through serendipity that you come across some new learning that could be valuable. So don't just go to see the companies that but try to see something a little bit fresh and new. So I would encourage people to try that.
Leaving time to, I think, walk the floor is really important. I haven't managed to get on that VR roller coaster yet, so I think I'm going to make sure I leave myself enough time this year to do that. Rob, what about yourself in terms of final thoughts for looking forward to the show?
Yeah, I kind of go back to COVID again. The first major MWC after COVID was an unbelievably joyous event. There's nothing quite like getting people together, even if it's 100,000 people together, to just connect. And there is real value in that. That's the thing you just can't do online. So yeah, that's what I look forward to. You sit down with people that you've normally only seen in two dimensions on a screen somewhere, and have a conversation. Which is why, again, I go back to try to treat analyst relations as a relationship business, not as a kind of one-time sequence of events. So yeah, it's good to be there. It's good to see what people, how people behave and what they say, when you're up close in a room with them and they have a chance to have an open conversation. Back to Ruth's point about, about using this as a kind of a safe space to ask the questions. And we will ask the questions of you, that don't seem to add up, the things that we can't necessarily always say quite in public either. Why did you buy this company, or why don't you buy that company, or whatever it is. So those are things that are always I always look forward to. It is a busy show. Don't buy new shoes the week before. Wear your comfortable. They might be beaten up, but wear them because they're going to last you 3 days. And plenty of water and food.
Comfortable shoes, I think, is always sound advice for MWC. Ruth, any final thoughts from you in terms of what you're looking forward to for the show next year?
Sure. So definitely I'm with Robert there. Comfortable shoes. I've packed heels 2 years in a row and never worn them, just in case. That is not needed. Just get your best trainers out. In terms of what I'm looking forward to, so I actually really enjoy the networking side. So, sometimes you can randomly bump into someone that you've known 10, 15 years in the telecoms industry in the hallway or as you're running between meetings. That's fantastic. Also, the evening networking events. So it's actually I find really useful being able to talk to both companies who invite you, other analysts, but get those kind of really broad perspectives, and perhaps analysts you've not met before or cover different areas. Those are also useful conversations for us to have as an industry. But back to my point about the Thursday, I really enjoy the Thursday. It's a little bit quieter. You've got the time, like James mentioned, to check out perhaps some of those stalls or big sites that you went past and thought that looks super interesting, but I haven't got the time at the moment to fully get into that before another meeting. So that's a really useful time, and often it's a time which allows you to kind of pick up the main vibe, the main themes, and almost clarify why you were there, what you've kind of taken away.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much for that. And thank you to all three of you for joining. I think to your point, Rob, these are great events and hopefully really useful for our audience, but nothing quite beats seeing industry colleagues networking out in Barcelona. And hopefully we'll get the chance to do that in March this year, not February, if we're not running between hall 3 and 6 in those comfortable shoes. Thank you all very much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you to our audience again for joining. We will post the session on our YouTube channel and throughout our socials. If you want to come back and watch anything, it will be available. See you out in Barcelona.
See you in Barcelona. Thanks very much.
Thank you.